Josh, great to be chatting with you today. We're going to be chatting about all things heaviness based. So, fairly broad question, but how would you define the term heaviness?
So that is quite a tricky one to answer. Yeah, more recently I've been sort of going back to trying to capture the feeling of being a kid when I discovered heavy music and what excited me. And it just so happened at that time, a lot of records were produced by Ross Robinson, who did a lot of like the new metal stuff, Korn and Slipknot. And those records, there's like a real intensity, particularly in like the vocal performances, that I think, like the liveliness of those records and the imperfections in the performance has sort of got lost to a degree over the years. But there's other things that have added to heaviness in terms of just the advances in technology and recording and people's processes, that you can still feel that heaviness come through in like a very dense modern mix, but in a slightly different way. And there's sort of two elements of it. There's like the weight and thickness and density of a really heavy metal mix, and then there's the performance side, which is about like intensity and the emotion and getting a bit more like human elements to come through, as opposed to everything too quantized or overproduced. But I think there's room for both, and I sort of find myself recently somewhere in the middle of those now.
Interesting. So, from that perspective, you're talking about the change from technology informing the production of heavy music. How would you say that idea of heaviness has changed over time from those initial Sabbath albums through to more modern productions?
Well, you can definitely like pinpoint a few like periods in heavy music, like the Black Album in particular, I think, and the Pantera stuff, which seemed to, I mean, maybe even Injustice for All with that was the first like really clicky kick drum, I think. But that was definitely like a turning point in production, I think, where things started to sound a lot more like mechanical and less like a vibey band. But yeah, I don't know. It's been a gradual process, I think, and I think there's a few people like Andy Sneap and Colin Richardson, I think, to me in the 90s, that really took elements of maybe the Black Album and what Pantera were doing and really like refined it. And to me, I think those guys kind of helped shape modern metal mixing to a degree, and like really focusing in on getting good tones, but still capturing some vibe and that sort of thing.
So there's obviously different forms that heaviness can take. Do you feel that there's perceptual heaviness in other music genres other than the metal genre?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can find heaviness in like some really crusty punk from the 80s that's not chug 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 or blast beats or death metal vocals, but it's like some of that early stuff that was almost like part of the grindcore scene is still heavy in a different way. And I'm sure there's, I mean, even like jazz, sometimes that stuff's like the really modern stuff where they're like screeching away on a saxophone. It's like, yeah, that's heavy, but in a ear-piercingly like chaotic way. And yeah, that heaviness can take on so many different forms. And I think, to me as a kid, when I was, like 13, getting into Slipknot, that was so heavy, and they got me into a lot of death metal stuff that they're name dropping interviews. But there's a heaviness to death metal that sometimes doesn't have the intensity and aggression that Slipknot had, who were, lumped in with new metal at the time. And there's something to be said for both. There's a heaviness to just being like a death metal band and everything's heavy, but sometimes it's not captured with the intensity of a band like Slipknot, where it just sounds like they are genuinely like angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reflecting on you listening to metal when you were a kid, what was the sort of psychology of that time? Like, what was the effect the music had on you with these different bands? We're talking about these different forms of heaviness. How did it sort of impact you as a listener from a sort of an emotional kind of perspective?
Yeah, and that's a huge thing. I had like I think a really great childhood, but when you're a teenager, I don't know if it's just your emotions or just an excited feeling, but I remember Slipknot, the first record in particular. I mean, the first two records were big for me, but The Great Southern Trendkill by Pantera, like there was just a feeling of like like energy, and I just want to like trash my bedroom to it. Not out of anger, just because like, I was just like pumped up by the music, and I still find that, and that's something that I kind of like always try and find. And more recently, I found like when writing music that, as most people in bands these days will sit at a computer writing music, that I've started to try and just like stand up and play guitar and try and like feel it a bit more than just focus in on that sort of thing. So there is like a physical element to heavy music, and you want to feel that sort of excitement or reaction when writing it or performing it, or as a listener, like it's fun when you get like hairs on the back of your neck stand up because something so like you can feel something heavy coming or something like that, and dynamics.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when we were chatting earlier about all these different aspects to heaviness, and you can even go so far as to say, you know, the album artwork and the logo or the band's image or your experience of live music can contribute to how you perceive the music as heavy. But from more of a mixed perspective, what do you feel the elements are that contribute to this sense of heaviness?
I mean, obviously you don't want a bloated low end, uneven low end, but if you don't have enough weight in your mix, and I like, not to get too specific already, but just like guitars recently, I found myself adding low end where I'd always thought like you just low and high pass filter, but now I find myself putting in some lows like at 80 to like make sure there's a density and a thickness to the guitars, and same with kick drums and snares. I mean, obviously the faster the music and the more there's going on, it's hard to balance that out, but that's where the real art of it is, to try and, when you're trying to focus on something being heavy, and I find saturation is a huge part of it. Even if you want like a more clean mix, I think things like clipping and saturating snare drums so they're just perceivably louder, even though they're not completely just sticking out over the mix, and getting them sounding dense, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that aspect of performance speed and tempi, and the way that provides the space available to, you know, it can be a real challenge. And it's amazing the albums that you listen to where there's actually not a lot of low end, but it's like Behemoth's Evangelion, which Colin mixed, and there's very little low end in it, but because the music's so fast, it provides very little space for that low end and for reverb.
Yeah, and I mean that mix in particular, like it still doesn't like feel like a thin mix. They've seemed to balance it out in a way that works, and they've found, like Colin really found the balance for that. But I mean, there are some records that I grew up with, like Far Beyond Driven, that I still listen to and think sounds good, but I've like looked at the kick drum, like just taken a sample of like the start of one of the songs, and like the high end really outweighs the low end.
Yeah.
Whereas I think in modern day mixing, you can find a way to bring a bit more of that up, and that's a bit more common now, to have a bit more low end in metal mixes, but it's hard, it's easy to go too far with the low end.
Very much, yeah. It's a bit of a pencil bouncing on a pane of glass, the kick drum on Far Beyond Driven, but that was, as you say, there's these albums that come out that really influence the way that metal music is produced, and becomes almost like a trend within the mixing style, which is accepted from a commercial perspective for a while, which is quite interesting. But the aspect of speed, and you mentioned earlier about the different performance approaches with very, very fast subdivisions. What are your feelings about, you were talking about the balance earlier between bands like, you know, Korn and Slipknot, where there was almost those errors in the performance, that it wasn't all quantized, and then the bands that are incredibly fast, and it's a lot of technological sort of mediation to get those performances tight. Is that an area where, when you're mixing, regardless of what the project is, that you're trying to strike a balance between this performance accuracy and quantization and tightness, because the standards of tightness have just gone up and up, and try and retain that natural, authentic vibe? Or is that not something that you ever really think about?
No, I do think about that. I think, I'll always push for, I mean, it depends on the musicians. I mean, I'll always try and push for the best possible performance, at least like technically speaking. from like the musicians, and then the vocals is slightly different. You want to get, if a performance vocally just feels right, then that's its own thing. But let's say guitar tracking, I want it as tight as possible, but I can hear when records have been note by note or quantized. You can tell. So you don't want it to sound like that. And sometimes you have to, you know, not play a riff all the way through to get it where it needs to be, or even like the player can play it perfectly, but just the way the riff is, there's a whoosh when you move to this position, and it's like he can play it perfectly, or she, but let's just avoid that noise and just edit in for that bit. And I think that sort of thing's fine and it's quite common, but you can definitely go too far and have everything gridded 100% with the drums, which is just too much because it just sounds programmed. And you can overdo the guitars, you can over edit them. So I'll always chase perfection, but to a limit where I know when it's just sounds fake. And the difference is in playing like with guitars left and right. If everything's like perfect, like you can get phase issues again. And yeah.
That, when you're talking about that balance that you're trying to strike there, more broadly, what do you feel the central challenges are when you're mixing in addition to that? What are the main sort of challenges or problems you feel you're trying to solve when you're mixing a track?
I mean, the most common challenge is just in heavy music, everything is fighting to be the loudest thing in the mix. And as a guitarist, like, I like loud guitars, but the moment you feel like your kick and snare is not loud enough. So that, I mean, it's just the same thing. You just want everything as loud as possible, and that's where things like saturating and clipping can come in to help with drums, or parallel compression, because I like really aggressive sounding snares with a lot of attack, but that can turn into like just a little bit of a blip in the mix if there's not enough sustain to your snare sound. And just getting the levels, yeah, just like the levels of a kick and snare in particular, I think, because I'll listen to stuff I did a few years ago and the snare's like taking my head off, it's too loud. And then more recently, maybe I've been going a little bit too low with it. So it's just balancing everything out is just the most common thing.
We were chatting before about how technology and the ability to quantize and auto-tune and all of these technologies that have really facilitated metal music production. Do you see that journey continuing with technology?
I'm not too technologically minded, so I can't really say either way because it's not something I pay much attention to in terms of the progression. I can't see how it could get much better, but I would assume that that's how people felt 10, 20 years ago. Yeah. And it's, you know, yeah, doubled, if not tripled or more in terms of what's come along in recent years. So I can't picture it, but I assume it will just keep continuing. Sure. But I imagine, not even from an AI point of view, but just to a degree that there'll be advancements in things that just make mixing a lot easier, which will almost get close to like AI mixing it. But so many plugins coming out now that are just pre-mixing things for you, and I don't mean just presets, just things that make life easy, like Soothe plugin, like on overheads or vocals, like they're just like, we just chuck that on, it's just like, oh, that's just solved all my problems. Yeah. So, yeah.
More broadly, do you feel that lo-fi production standards can be as heavy as hi-fi production standards, high fidelity production standards?
What's your definition of lo-fi? Because to me, I always just think of like thin sounding stuff. Like, is that
sort of black metal lo-fi, yeah, like Dark Throne, those usually more black metal productions that were lo-fi. So comparing, say, Dimmu Borgir with more of the
more traditional stuff. Yeah. I mean, I am familiar with that, and my own understanding of lo-fi, I always just think of it as thinner sounding, but I don't know if that specifically means just less polished. But yeah, I think it can be heavy, but it's just a different way. It's just like a more abrasive, like chainsaw to the ear, as opposed to a freight train rolling over you or something like that. I don't know, in terms of I guess it's like different ways of being killed in a horror film, you know, like it can still be heavy and aggressive, but in a different way. But the heaviness is, to me, like the heaviest mixes are the ones where everything's just
Yeah.
thick and nasty.
Which metal albums have you produced that presented the most challenges to you, and how did they turn out? The ones that really presented all these challenges that you needed to do lots of revisions for. And
To be honest, I don't do a lot outside of the bands I've been in. So with Silosis, I've got such a clear vision of what I want that I just go on forever, and that's different to when I've worked with other artists and it's someone else's music and I can just get there just in a couple of days, where I could have spent months on Cycle of Suffering by Silosis, just constantly going back over it, like, oh, I'm just going to I'm going to reamp the guitars for the 10th time, it's not quite what I want. So that's been a challenge. But with Architects, the second record I did with them, For Those That Wish to Exist, I didn't mix the record, but there's so much going on in terms of all the different synth layers, and I'd sort of pre-mix them and try and get everything balanced out before going off to be mixed, to try and, because when you've got so many tracks, especially synths and overdubs and everything, it can be really it can be a nightmare when you're mixing it to just be like, what am I supposed to do with this? So if I could pre-mix all of that stuff to a degree beforehand, so when it comes to mix revisions, it's like, oh, can you just turn this up by a dB as opposed to turn that up by 10 dB, this down by X amount. So that was tricky, and I'd use with like the synth stuff in particular, there'd be a lot of synths where the transient of a note would be like way louder than the sustain. I'd use like transient designers to take off all the attack and push the sustain, or use the soothe plugin a lot to get rid of any like whistly frequencies and some of the more like harsh synth sounding stuff. And then I don't know to what degree Zach, who mixed the record, may have done even more heavy-handed stuff his end, but it just getting stuff all balanced out was tricky in that regard.
And we talked earlier about these landmark metal albums that really had quite a broad impact on how metal music is produced. Which do you feel, from this idea of perceptual heaviness, which it's a difficult question, but which were the albums that you listened to where you really went, that is so heavy?
Yeah, it's different. Yeah, I have like just loads of albums that stand out from my childhood. Like the Black Album is one that I think, like Sad But True for the time, would have been one of the heaviest, mixes in terms of, and like just great tones at the same time, not just the heaviness, but like it sounds really good and still stands up to this day. But then like Iowa by Slipknot, which is like I think it's an Andy Wallace mix. It's just like, it's still just so abrasive in it, but it's also thicker than like the first album was. You can almost say that was a bit lo-fi by today's standards. So like Iowa's just got the intensity for me, and just the overall grime and more of the imperfections in it that makes it more real and visceral and abrasive. And then a record just from my youth that I don't necessarily think is necessarily a record that would be unanimously agreed upon, but Cannibal Corpse Bloodthirst, which is a Colin Richardson mix, was just one of the ones for me personally. I was like, this is great. And I still think that one holds up pretty well by today's standards. That was like 99 maybe.
It's interesting when you listen back to albums that you really were a fan of when you were young, and you don't listen to them for many years, and you go back to them and they either really hold up, or sometimes the opposite, where you're like, yeah, I don't quite get it with that. It's interesting. I was listening to some Forbidden albums.
Oh yeah. Twisted into Form
and Eternal Nightmare by Violence, and listening to some of the early thrash albums, and so
all of those. Yeah, I mean, for me in particular, I didn't grow up on that era. So getting into thrash and wanting to find all these albums, I find all the records and love all the riffs, but I was like, I just wish that was a bit like I wish they had put reverb on the guitar tone on whatever record, or that sort of thing, or mic it up from across the room and all that sort of stuff.
So true. You get these sort of like nasally, honky guitar tones with reverb on.
Yeah.
It's like,
and the riffs are amazing. That one record that stood out to me, the first Testament record I got, was First Strike Still Deadly. So it's all their old classic stuff done by Andy Sneap. It's like perfect balance for me because I love the music, but the mixes are really great and dense.
What sort of trade-offs and limitations with your processing approaches are you looking at? Again, we've been chatting about these different qualities that you're trying to get. You know, you're saying about the drums coming through, but getting the sustain of the snare and sort of like transient designers to. But do you have these sort of trade-offs that you're trying to get, like with, say, with quad track guitars that are really thick and dense tones, it causes more of a problems in the drums coming through, or with greater sample use, it makes it easier to mix and they punch through the guitars more, but they tend to sound more processed? Do you? And again, I found it interesting. You were talking about, you know, the Slipknot albums and the Korn albums that had this sort of performance authenticity, and then the more technologically mediated where it's all quantized and you can hear it's all put together, and you're looking at a trade-off with those. Do you have a trade-off when you're processing guitars or drums where you're trying to, you've got, well, the more of that provides this, but the downside of that is this? Does that make sense?
With guitars in particular?
And the rest of the mix in general, with guitars and bass, guitars and drums, bass and drums?
Yeah, definitely. I think just quickly, like, I still think you can get the super heavy and tight, ultra tight performances without going super quantized. Like if you look at The Gathering by Testament, the rhythm playing super, or even And Justice for All, like that's all done to tape and the performances are as tight as they need to be. So it can be done without going in, but the musicianship, particularly with younger bands, which is, you know, I've recorded a lot of, or younger or just not as professional, that you have to rely on more, you know, like we're going to have to punch in just for that riff as opposed to half the song. With regards to guitars, yeah, it's a trade-off trying to get the low end right, and you know, it's quite a common trick to multi-band compress the low end for the palm mutes and that sort of thing. I found more recently that I've been carving out more low end or lower mids, like around 120, where the palm mute build-ups normally are, and just adding more in around 80 hertz and get more of the sub coming through. But yeah, I used to find that the more low and high pass filtering that I did, particularly high pass filtering, getting rid of the low end, if you do it too much, you're only left with the muddy part of the low end. So if you leave a bit more of the subbier stuff, even if there's not much of it in there, and just do a little carve, I found that's something that helps my guitars feel a bit more, still be thick but not too muddy. But I hate to say that I use my eyes quite a lot with the Fab Filter EQ, but I think you can kind of just see where you're at in terms of where's the resonance of the low end on the kick drum, where is it on the snare, does it need to be there in the guitars, is the snare poking through there, can I afford to lose a bit of low end or low mids where the snare low end is in my guitar tone or on the bass, and you can visually see where this stuff is now, and that makes life a lot easier to know if your mix is like your low end's building up in one place or that sort of thing. But and especially with like kick drums and bass low end. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of strike that balance. And that's not something that I do all the time. I haven't done it with this, or I haven't done it in quite a while, but you can find when you've done like a mix and you listen to it in the car and you're like, why is the whole mix like woo, 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 and everything's just in the same area.
Yeah. Does it differ from mix to mix the way you go about using distortion and parallel compression, or do you tend to have a set approach that you'll default to first of all?
Yeah, it really depends on the band and the type of music. If something's a bit more like modern and maybe more hardcore influenced, I can't think of any examples. Stuff like I mixed some Malevolence live tracks for their YouTube recently, and they're, you know, a metal band, but it needs to sound really aggressive and stand up against a lot of the more, I don't know, I think about a band like Knock Loose, which is a bit more not quite as polished metal mix as like, say, like the Andy Sneap, Colin Richardson sort of thing. So I would try and add a bit more like saturation to the drums and density and punch, and just focus on the heaviness. Whereas if I was doing like, done a band like Divine Chaos, like a thrash band, I'd go more for like a more Sneapy, Colin Richardson sort of like, not quite as bloated mix that the emphasis isn't more on like the heaviness, it's more on like the metallic tones. So my approaches will be different. So for example, yeah, clipping and saturating the drums a lot more for the more modern metalcore or hardcore leaning stuff, and not being quite as saturated or distorted with the more traditional metal stuff.
So discussing that perspective where you'll vary your processing approach depending on the project, is that similar with the number of kick and snare samples you use, and do you tend to use drum samples taken from the kit used for tracking?
If I can, I'll use samples from the kit, and something that I've tried to do, and in my head it should work, but it never sounds. I don't know why I've never had as much success with it as it should have in my head. But I'll take like really hard snare samples from a session, and I would have like triggered the snare just with all the hard hits, and then just splice in all the rolls to be natural. But I found just not doing that for the consistency of the tone of the snare. Just treating a real snare track like a real snare track. But yeah, I'm not shy with using triggers, and especially with today with like slate trigger and multi samples, that if you're pay attention to detail on like fast snare rolls, and you know you might have to edit a certain hit on the audio to trigger like a louder or softer hit, that you can lean on samples a bit more and still have a natural feel. But yeah, I'd like to try and use samples from the kit and as much real mics as possible. But when it comes to samples, I always just would rather use just one as opposed to blending them, and I will just create my own blends of like either one shot samples or multi samples, where so I've got like 6 or 7 good hits from a kick drum from a session. If I want to make a sample of that and I want another sample blended in, I'll just make the samples with the blend that I like, just so I'm not dealing with loads of different tracks. And especially when you're doing a record, I don't mix in the same session, so I'd rather have less like layers of samples in that regard. And I sort of like to just pre-make samples if I'm going to blend sounds in. The whole TCI like slate trigger file will have that blend done already.
When you're creating the snare samples and you've got clean hits from the kit used for tracking, do you focus more towards the room mics or the overheads or the spot mics, or a blend of?
Just close mics. But one thing that can really help a performance if you're using a lot more of the actual just real snare track is triggering the room mics. So there's a trick that I first heard about that from Andy Wallace years ago. I think it was about a System of a Down mix he did. But if you get the consistency of the room mic sound, it can balance out the inconsistency of the close mic, and it doesn't obviously sound as sample heavy because it's like an ambience that you're sampling as opposed to a close mic, which is like really obvious to hear the fakeness.
So from that perspective, not actually using the mic source itself as a room mic, but a sample of that and triggering it every time.
Yeah, I mean, not always from the session, it depends, but even if I've got a really good room, so for example, the most recent Solosis record we tracked at Chapel Studios, and it's a great sounding room. I feel like one of the channels might have been a bit dodgy on the desk, and every now and then it might sort of like dip a bit on one side, which I only discovered mixing it here. So not being able to lean on those room mics as much, I just like trigger a sample and not necessarily one from that room. And I don't think it always makes a huge difference when you've blended in. I'm still using the real room mics, but blending in a sample from, you know, like an expansion pack that's got a nice sounding room that just works. But even if I'm using samples on the snare, there's probably always a room mic sample in what I do.
Yeah. And mentioning Andy Wallace, what's always been I found interesting about Andy Wallace is his use of snare samples and kick samples that don't actually feature in the mix directly, but are sent pre-fade to reverb.
Yeah. That's a similar thing. Yeah.
Is that something you'll often use, or it depends
No,
on the project?
I've never done that. No, it's I guess it's a similar approach to just triggering a room sample, but obviously it's a reverb as opposed to like a room ambience.
So we've got a really interesting area of discussion there where we're talking about sort of authenticity of performance and then the impact of technology, but also composition, where you've also talked about when you're composing the Silosis record and trying to capture the dynamics and that feeling of energy from the music that influenced you when you were young. How much do you feel that this idea of performance intensity is impacting how we perceive heaviness? For example, Andrew Sheps really talked about the mix, the In Solitude mix, that he felt it's really in the midsection where that's the heaviness, the slowest. But do you feel that there's just different ways of composing and performing that all contribute to this sense of heaviness and expectation and sections that become before other sections?
Yeah, I think that makes a huge difference. I think it was one of a booking agent that worked with architects that said it to one of those guys years ago, comparing like dance music to metal stuff, especially like hardcore things where you have like these breakdowns, but it's like the build up. So in a lot of like EDM dance music, you'll have like just a build up and then you get the drop where it all kicks in, and you'll get that in like the equivalent in metal would be just reference Slipknot, like Disaster Piece. There's this midsection heavy riff that comes in with double pedal. If it just came in after the chorus, it'd be like, oh, that's a cool riff. But it builds and builds and builds with like a long snare roll. So building tension into the composition, I think, is like one of the best ways to then lead up to something. Because if you just have loads of great riffs and they just all come in, and there's not much dynamics to the songwriting, you just kind of get a bit like numb to it.
The other thing that's really interesting is this idea of heaviness becoming a moving target as well. Andrew Sheps was talking about when he heard AC/DC's Back in Black for the first time, it was like, that is the heaviest thing that I've ever heard, and that, that's changed over time. And bands like Malevolence and obviously Knocked Loose as well, they've got this really almost sludgy sense of heaviness as well. But it's the idea of what comes before and after certain parts and how it gets built up to, like in your Slipknot example, it's a really, really important point.
Yeah, I think those two bands like Malevolence and Knocked Loose do that as well. Like the way riffs are introduced, can just really adds to the heaviness. You can't always just like expect an amazing riff to be perceived as amazing as you might think it is if you haven't introduced it in a way that it's gonna like be like, here it is, like, I mean, it's like Enter Sandman, just the whole intro to the song's a build up, and then when the riff finally comes in, especially if you see it live and you've got a big pyro explosion, it's like, oh, there's the riff. Yeah. Whereas if the song just started like it just comes out of nowhere, it's not going to feel the same.
Great example. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.